How many participants?
I got Mark.
This is Mike Weston with King City. Hopefully those of you that are online can hear me. We'll be getting going here in just a minute.
Are you coming? Yep.
And do you have any word from Jan?
I'm on vacation.
What? I called one from Joe. He's in Scotland, and I know Andy texted me.
3 minutes ago. Okay, you'll be here in 5. Okay.
It's all right. We can still work on it and get through some of the code stuff. But it's just a work session, so.
Sure.
Yeah, you guys can come up to the table. We're just gonna be working on some of the code stuff, so we're gonna have Marcy and Todd give us some quick presentations, and then we can answer any questions. Carol will be here in a minute, and do a little one-on-one interactions here.
Dan's not gonna be here. I forwarded that to you and Annie.
All right.
Put that on the 8th. Left yes. So,
Joe's in
still,
Scotland.
Joe's still in Scotland, and then Annie, I didn't know Annie was able to go, otherwise I would have.
You can still, it just won't be an official meeting, so you can go ahead and, sign off, because we won't have a quorum. But we can still do, well, we could just keep it going.
We'll just keep it going and just tell them, hey, we don't have a
Yeah,
quorum, but it's just.
It's an information session anyway, so. What's our, did we change to kingcity.gov, right?
No, not yet. I'm still checking on the, DNS for that.
Okay. Steve's online, is that correct?
Steve is online.
I pull mine up too. Got comments from, Metro today.
They're not the TSC, or not.
Yeah, they combined them, yeah. Part of them, but I haven't gone through all of them. Got through the Metro conditions portion, and then
long the record is going
Hard to say, based on, it'll be open for as long as, the hearing body leaves it open, you know, so,
to,
the transportation system plan, ideally, the city council would close the public record at the end of the public testimony on, the 17th, May 17th. And then they can consider all the evidence in the record. They might choose to leave the record open for a week or so. It's really up to them what they want to do on that front. But the master plan will still be open until probably June or so. And these, what we're working on right now is, code amendment with the, so I guess we don't even have to call it to order.
No, we can't call it the
Yeah.
way.
So what we're working on is code amendments that follow the transportation system plan and the Kingston Terrace master plan. Both of those, policy documents, create policies and guidelines for us to implement. And then the code work and the SDC that, or SDC methodology that FCS and Todd and his group are working on, basically implement the financing, strategy of those two documents. So, what Marge is gonna present today is some of the code stuff that we're trying to implement, to control like design and neighborhood features and get the kind of community feeling that we were shooting for in the master plan. And so with that, I'm just gonna let Marcy jump into her presentation.
Mike, you wanna also let us speak, just for the record, saying that we are not opening the meeting to.
I think they can hear, right? I just said it a minute ago, but,
Say it again.
you wanna promote me to a panelist?
No.
were we supposed to be sent this, PowerPoint presentation?
No, PowerPoint just came in, but did you get the, code work?
I got the packet and I got one called King City
Yeah,
PowerPoint, and then I have,
okay.
the one, a planning commission workshop.
Yep, that's what we're gonna go through today, is the draft. And then, hopefully Carol gets here shortly.
So ladies and gentlemen, just so you know that we are not going to officially open the public meeting, or the meeting, because we do not have a quorum. But we still want to, give the information to the public, so the public is aware, and that, the commissioners that are present are aware.
No, we will not. This is it. Yep, by all means.
Your name, last time I was here, which is the first time I saw you, your nameplate wasn't that.
Yeah.
I haven't made it yet.
I still don't know where to get it.
We don't need it.
Got here. And we're gonna have Carol here soon?
Okay.
She has a soft voice.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm probably gonna blow them out, but.
So, I'm just gonna go through this presentation. Before I do that, it's, just wanna point out that this packet was sent to the planning commissioners and is on the city's website for this session. And it consists of a draft version of the code, and, preceding that are a few pages that go through it section by section and describe what those sections are for. And there, excuse me, there were basically three, code pieces that were included in this packet. One is the discussion draft of the, Kingston Terrace Development and Design Standards, amendments to an existing article about procedures, that is how different actions in Kingston Terrace will be handled, and then a new section that will be added to the King City Code about annexation. So now I'm going to give a presentation, just an overview about the purpose of this piece of the project. So if we could go back to responsibilities of the code. Obviously, this zoning code and procedures, it's about implementing the master plan, which is based on the concept plan, which has been several years in the making, so it's consistently adding on more detail and filling in the vision. So the code will actually codify that vision and regulate the development so that we can be sure that development is consistent with the vision. It's quite clear that development may take many years to be realized for the whole area, but that upon adoption of the code, some development will likely occur pretty quickly after. So next slide, please. The whole of the code is adding to or amending the existing Title 16. There are different pieces. The Kingston Terrace area will be regulated differently than existing King City, so it's going to have its own new chapter. And that will be subject, the new development in the area, new development and or remodels of existing buildings will be subject to this new chapter. Next. And there are a lot of provisions that apply in King City to development, and many of those are going to be superseded by provisions in the new code. Some will continue to apply, and some are modified, and a table that details that is actually included in the first few pages of the code. 16.1441. Let me talk about annexation. There, like I mentioned, there's a new proposed annexation chapter that is included in your packet, the proposed version. I want to just explain a few things about it. It's treating the Kingston Terrace, that is properties west of 137th, differently than those east of 137th, in that the comprehensive plan and zoning designation of Washington County will apply east of 137th to be consistent with the way that annexation has been managed in that area up to this point. However, west of, or in the Kingston Terrace proper area, annexation will, the goal is to assign comprehensive plan and zoning designations based upon the new code at the time of annexation for those properties. Still under discussion in the annexation chapter is which types of applications are quasi-judicial or legislative.
What section is that?
That is 16.192.
And so what's under question on that portion?
Under discussion is quasi-judicial and versus legislative. We have two procedures described there, and it's not been, under discussion is which applications will be subject to which.
Do you have a page on that? 16.192, you said?
And yeah, in your existing code, you'll just see
Oh.
under development, but in the packet, it's on the last two pages of the packet,
Last two pages, gotcha. All right, go in there now.
an attachment.
Come on, come on.
Hey,
Hey, no worries, thanks for making it.
I'm just going through a presentation about the code piece. The code piece. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, so I was just trying to get an idea of what we're trying to accomplish with this. So I just want to look over it. Because I think this is pretty central to the management side of the house, like how we manage it internally. And so just wanted to peek. Sorry, I didn't get a chance to review that piece. Wait, it's under annexation or?
In your existing code, the one that's available online and that you use every day, it says chapter 16.192 under development or something like that. And in the packet, we have a two-page attachment.
For annexation.
Correct.
Okay, so it's not what I was thinking. I thought it was identifying how to handle quasi-judicial and legislative matters. Because right now our code doesn't say, it doesn't define type 1, type 2, type 3, or type 4. And so I thought Keith was going to add some of that.
We do have a procedures,
A
chapter.
procedures amendment?
It's also included in here, and it starts on, it's the second attachment. Let me just, so it's page 1. Well, that doesn't help. It's, I guess this, PDF does not have, it's the second attachment, which means that if you were to go to the end of page, if you go to page 46 in the packet,
Okay.
and then you go to the very next page, it should be attached as an attachment. And it says Article 2 Procedures, Chapter 16.32. And it's 32 pages long.
Okay. I'm almost there. All right. 16.32, you said?
Yeah. So this is the proposed, and I want to emphasize that this is a discussion draft, and we will be bringing these forward for hearings in June.
Oh, cool. Yeah, they do have it here. Type 2, type 3. All right, nice. All right.
Okay, so this is the general procedures kind of rewrite as proposed by Keith. That would apply to all development. The annexation piece that I was talking about just applies to annexation.
All right.
You didn't have an annexation
Right.
chapter before?
Yeah, we just kind of.
We were relying on the ORS, which was not very good. It was not a very good base because we didn't have a process. So it was really kind of frustrating.
You
But
do have several mentions of annexation in your code, but
Yeah.
they're kind of all over the place.
yeah,
So this would bring them all into one place.
cool.
So Marcy, what I did for annexation in ORS and Metro, I made a check that I need to do. That's something that's gonna be in that chapter too.
Yeah, I would think so.
Okay.
But that's probably a question to pick up with Keith when he comes back. Could we make a note of that and ask him? Yeah.
A while because they don't really help you out.
Yeah, do you have other, well, it may come up as we talk about these other things, if you have other checklists as well. Okay, so that's annexation. Let's talk about natural resources. The next slide, please. We know this is really important, and this chapter, it will be in chapter 16.114.110, habitat conservation areas. It's going to be a new chapter as well. It will describe how the city protects natural areas at the time of development. It establishes procedures and criteria for protection on all properties located in Kingston Terrace. It must comply with Section 4 of Metro's Urban Growth Management Functional Plan. And this chapter is being drafted while we speak. It wasn't ready for this packet yet, and we're working closely with Metro to develop it. I'll just point out a few more things about it, that the upland habitat, or Class A and B, will be protected by King City. So in addition to rules, new regulations that comply with Metro, so there will be new regulations that are King City's to administer on kind of at their own call. And if we could go to the next slide, I pulled up 3 maps that Steve presented at the master plan session, just to illustrate the different types of natural resource areas under different administration. These were slides that he went over in on April 26th. So I want to make it clear that the wetlands that are mapped, according to these maps and Metro's maps, are based on an overhead view, and they're somewhat out of date, and at the time of development, it will be the responsibility of the applicant to bring current delineation into as part of their application, to delineate the actual wetlands and all of their classifications at that time. And riparian areas, where they exist, class 1 and 2 will be protected by Clean Water Services, or will be subject to the requirements of Clean Water Services that are administered by King City. And upland habitat, or class A and B, will be administered by King City. Those are mostly going to have to do with tree preservation and tree replacement. So this is a very important, complicated section of the code, and you'll be hearing more about it when we get closer to the hearings. Do you have any overall questions about it right now?
I have some about the annexation.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Like, is it gonna be, is Washington County gonna have the jurisdiction forever, or is King City gonna take that over at some point?
We
all of-
want to bring a lot of that in-house.
All of Kingston Terrace will become, it's actually not, if we could go back to that slide for a second, it's probably a little bit confusing when you read the slide. It's just the one before. So it says, the third bullet, areas east of 137, comp plan and zoning designations will conform to Washington County Comprehensive Plan and zoning designations. They'll still be King City, but they will, in order to be, to not throw chaos into people who have kind of a certain expectation for, who live east of 137, they're already, in their annexation procedures, it was historically, that they would conform to Washington County Comprehensive Plan and zoning designations. Because there was no Kingston Terrace. Now there's new Kingston Terrace zoning code that will apply to Kingston Terrace, but it won't apply to areas east of 137, because that might be too dramatic a change. I think that's the idea. Does that make sense?
I guess I don't get how it would be dramatic. I mean, is it dramatic in the short term or long term?
The definitions for housing types are going to be dramatically different for King City than with Washington County. The zoning designations will be dramatically different. The whole method of regulating land use in Kingston Terrace is quite different from the way that Washington County regulates land use, in that we've talked about a form-based approach that applies to Kingston Terrace. And I do think it would be too dramatically different for property owners who are living in the existing King City east of 137 if they wanted to go through an annexation procedure. It's not that there aren't that many properties, right, that would go through that process, but it would be, I think, too dramatically different to expect those small number of properties, if they ever did, to conform to the new Kingston Terrace zoning.
Okay.
Yeah,
Or conform to the zoning that applies to all of their neighboring properties.
Okay.
So it's kind of grandfathering in the
Yes,
stuff.
exactly.
Will that change with, property, not in change of ownership, but in change of use? Let's say somebody wants to subdivide their property. In that,
So,
That's not an annexation, then.
yeah, so if they were annexed into the city, right, like say, for instance, you have the properties that are south of Fisher and, between 131st and 99W, right? And so say those properties were to annex into King City, they would be, under our current system, applied a zone, as closely related to the current Washington County urbanized zone. And then they would still fall under the governing doctrine of the King City, Development Code, which currently exists.
okay,
However, if there's a parcel over in Kingston Terrace that annexes into King City, there's a whole new governing doctrine, if you will, for that parcel versus the one that's over on the old King City portion.
okay,
Because when that area was brought into the urban growth boundary, there was a different set of rules for the older portion of King City.
right, yeah,
And then when this area is brought in, now we have certain density requirements and
okay,
environmental protections and everything else that have to come into play. There's a higher level of regulation over in the Kingston Terrace area than there is currently on the books for the area that was brought into the urban growth boundary and developed under county zone.
Right.
And so one of the agreements that we had with Washington County is the areas within current King City city limits, when brought in, will be applied a zone as close to Washington County as possible.
Okay,
Whereas in the Kingston Terrace area, that is not the case. The zoning that we apply will be as closely related to the community plan and the values and virtues that are adopted through the master plan and transportation system plan,
okay,
not necessarily Washington County zone.
okay.
So the people who are in that Washington County zone ever want to sell their property for development, would it then be to fit more of the county standards?
So they probably fall under like the R9 or R12 zoning that King City currently applies to areas that are annexing. So take the Highlands, for instance. The Highlands just recently annexed in 2017, and they were applied the county R9. It's the city R9 zoning, but it's basically taken from Washington County and then moved over. So then there's not a big disruption on their allowed uses, or all of a sudden creating a situation where everybody's non-conforming and nobody can do anything with their property. It kind of avoids some of that, some of those headaches, because if you've ever experienced having a non-conforming use, it makes it really difficult to do much of anything. And if you ever want to replace what you have, you only have like 12 months to try to do it, and you can only do it if like 25 or 30% of the structure is still there, or there's like percentages in to be classified as non-conforming use. So.
Okay. I guess what I was asking is, I don't know how big the properties are, but if I have a, let's say, 2-acre property in that gray zone there, and I decide I only need 1 acre, and I decide to divide my property, does the building on the new parcel, the new acre parcel, will that be kind of grandfathered in and I can build a nice house on 1 acre? Or will my density requirements be put into place?
You would have density requirements. So if you were to split your property, right? So in that situation, I think the wisest thing the property owner could potentially do is partition the property into 2 different parcels, right? And then take the other parcel that they want to develop, and then on that parcel, they'd have to meet their density provisions, I would imagine.
Okay.
However, I think that there was some question about that, Marcy, and you might, Keith knows more about it, but we were looking at parcels currently in King City where the density provision for the whole lot, so they had about 1 acre, and they had their old house on there. And what we did is we took the parcel and then subtracted what the parcel of the house was from, and then took the remainder and decided what the density provision was based on that remainder.
Okay, that's what's going on.
Yeah, that's what kind of happened over in the Ponderosa Pines development. I think that's what happened there, and I think that Keith worked to try to clarify that following that when we did our last set of code amendments. So hopefully that's already been addressed and is in the code in that fashion, not pertaining to this. So.
But pertaining to the middle housing, the changes there, those would apply.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think that's when Keith had modified that section, is when we did the middle housing amendment.
There will still be a minimum density that applies even to those grandfathered properties.
Yeah.
That came in through the middle housing.
Yeah, when those areas got brought into the urban growth boundary, I think Metro kind of put it's almost like a 10 unit per acre minimum density for most of King City. That's basically from 99W to the Bonneville line.
Okay.
It has that minimum 10 acre, or 10 units per acre density. And so when we're looking at this area over in Kingston Terrace, I think we're still around the 10 to 12 units per acre is what the base density is, but some of the areas have a higher density expectation,
Okay.
And then other areas have a lower density expectation.
So
When
is that delineated?
it's delineated by the community. Did you just have the community map up a second ago, I thought?
We haven't fixed those required, those aspirational densities for each neighborhood,
Right.
because it's actually changing a little bit as we're mapping the natural, as we're, figuring out exactly how the natural resource areas are gonna be regulated, and which of those are gonna come out of the developable areas typically. But you're correct that it's about 12 to 15 dwelling units per acre is the minimum that will have to be met in every neighborhood, but it is higher in the town center area.
Yeah, because, having worked as a planner and also having worked on the development side, I know I would, as a planner, to okay something, it'd be hard not to have a clear map. And I know on the developer side, how to get as many lots onto a piece of property as I can, so I can make more money. So if it's unclear, developer wins. And as a planner, I may not want that to happen, so I think, it's probably really important.
No, it will be very clear. As I said, this code is a draft. This is a draft
Okay.
version of the code,
Yeah.
this one here, and, we're having hearings on it in,
Yeah, it's,
hang on, it's at the end of my presentation, I included the date. 6/27 is your planning commission hearing on this code,
yeah.
Okay,
and 8/2 is the city council. So, there will be much more detail coming forward, about the density targets and how those are gonna be spelled out.
okay.
But actually, this next slide that I was gonna talk about I think it'll clarify some things called development agreements. It's, slide 8. Thank you. So this is a really important section to review in your draft, which you received in your packet. It starts on page 8, and it's 16.1 and 4050. How a developer or an applicant is, how it is communicated, what they're required to do. A lot of that takes place during the development agreement phase. So the development plan approval process ensures that it's set up to ensure that each development will contribute all the things that they're required to. The transportation, network, the public infrastructure that's going to be required, and all the other facilities in the plan, water, sanitary, streets, et cetera. All of those will have to be, it will have to be proven during that development agreement process that these have adequate capacity, that the development brings adequate capacity for the development. And some of the things that will be required are development plan, existing conditions, grading and erosion control. This is the third bullet. Circulation, parking, landscape, exterior lighting, waste and recycling, architectural elevation, floor plans, and descriptions. That will all be kind of communicated and approved at the development agreement phase. It's going to be spelled out extremely precisely what the minimum density is at that point as well, what parks need to be provided or how they're going to be provided. So somebody they're bringing in a property and it's in one of those quarter-mile circle areas where there's a park designation. It will be agreed during that period how they will either incorporate the park into their development, or possibly an in lieu fee, or contribute to the park system, development. So this is detail that's being spelled out right now as we speak. Not ready for this draft yet, but you'll see it later. The system, though, how it's all going to be agreed upon, is spelled out in the review process for the development agreement. There's one little thing at the end here that is being proposed, that development plans that meet all the criteria, they would get a type 2 review. Development plans that come in with, say a developer says, I want to do this thing differently, I want to vary from the regulations here, that would go through a type 3 approval process. And again, I would like to encourage you to read that section so that you can have comments.
So that would be just Keith and Mike.
It's true, we're very mindful of that as we write the administrative rules, that it's a small staff that's administering this, yeah. That's also why it's important that the requirements be extremely precise, spelled out numerically, clear and objectively, when, as much as possible. Any other questions about that?
I'm minor.
It is defined in here.
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't have that.
It's,
What page are you on? Because I have that on my phone here.
it's on page 8.
Okay.
Which page number are you looking at? Because I have page 16, page 9, some of the pages are not, anyone?
So,
There's a few attachments and they have,
Oh,
but go in the front section, from the front, if you could go to page 8. Second section.
this is the agenda. Okay, so this is a packet. So their numbers are going to be different because it rewrites the packet numbers.
Oh, okay.
So.
Can you look for the header that says 16.114050?
Yeah, that works.
what did you say? 16?
16.114.050. This review process.
What page is it on? Page 8?
So, do you see the part that says number 3, approval process? Okay, so this is the question that Commissioner Bellows was asking, what's a minor, change? Spelled out here. So A describes a development plan that's consistent with the applicable regulations and standards of this chapter shall be administered and reviewed as a type 2 city manager decision in accordance with, the development code. B, a development plan that includes minor changes shall be administered and reviewed as type 3. And then it goes on to describe, and this is, again, under development, the red indicates that it's, part of the discussion draft. So some of these numerical targets may change. You can see Roman small numeral 2 says, does not result in a density of 10% below target. That would be considered to be a minor change, but that would push it into a type 3 review. And so some of these other listings just indicate the types of things that would be considered minor changes. And this is the way this system is supposed to work, and the way that it's being crafted is so that a relatively small staff can administer it. So this part, I encourage you to review it and comment on it or ask more questions as we proceed through the refinement of this discussion draft.
My first meeting was a meeting where they were asking for a change. And, at that meeting, there was quite a bit of, because we're developing in an area that people have, are still very sensitive about what's going on around them. Skipping the type 3, you're going from a type 2 to a type 4, skipping the type 3 approval process. it might, it just might then become more complicated.
Are we skipping type 3?
Yeah, you're going from type 2 for minor changes to a type 4. Bringing in city council and the whole thing, I hear this.
So aren't minor changes type 3s?
Yeah, that's what it says here.
Yeah, so,
A development plan that includes minor changes shall be administered and reviewed as a type 3 planning commission
Okay,
decision.
all right. It looked to me like there were minor changes that were okay to, what that says is type 2, development plans with minor changes, okay, type 3. I have to look.
yeah, so it basically, yeah,
The punctuation there.
right.
Right.
The semicolon is supposed to divide the two, so development plans meeting all criteria equals type 2.
Yeah, got it.
Development plans with minor changes equals type 3.
Right, yeah.
So if it meets everything in the code, then like, I or the community development director could
Yeah.
sign off and
Right,
call it a
got it,
day.
yeah. No, it was the punctuation there, though.
And if it has any, so I guess if there's any subjectivity,
Uh-huh,
then it would come to the planning commission for
Right, yeah.
review.
Yeah.
So if there's something like like a design review that is outside of the confines of the master plan or something to that
Uh-huh.
effect, then it would probably come to the planning commission as a type 3, I would imagine, or a subdivision that doesn't necessarily, meet all the requirements or whatever
Uh-huh.
that's in the code, or a variance,
Yeah.
or even like a planned unit development that's different than what's prescribed in the
Right.
code. Those would all be, planning commission items
Okay.
that would be raised to that level of community involvement.
Okay.
An example, also of like what would be considered a minor change, something that's varying from an actual spelled out standard. If you look at like the following page, page 9, for example, neighborhood circulation, it applies the following criteria to the street network within the Kingston Terrace area. And you'll see this, red line under 1. It says total length of a perimeter of a block per street shall not exceed 1,800 feet. So that would be a change. I believe that on the page 8, Roman numeral small 4 says, a minor change does not change the location of streets or pedestrian paths except as permitted in the applicable regulating plan. So, actually, this is not the best example. One of them, I'm looking for the one that says, streets can vary, backbone streets can vary in their location by a certain number of feet. And the certain number, say that we have a backbone street,
Uh-huh,
the backbone street map you're familiar with, and someone wants to build that, but the topography doesn't allow it to be built exactly where it's mapped.
uh-huh.
This is very likely. Or they want to build it on a property line, say,
Mhm.
and they want to vary it by, there's a certain amount of dimension that is variable. It's built into the code, 50 feet or 100 feet. It could vary. If they have to go beyond that for
Uh-huh,
some reason, then it would throw it into, might consider to be a minor change.
okay.
That's an example. But we're trying to spell out the location of everything to the extent that we possibly can, and then allow variation, again, with a numerical margin. But if you still have to go beyond that, then you would be forced to go through the type.
Or eventually, right, if you,
We don't talk about, beyond, which
Yeah.
we may need to talk about that. But the goal is to try to spell out, we have really designed this community down to the parcel level, and with a lot of intention about the topography and where the natural resources are, and how much density can be accommodated within these areas. It's really not the same kind of plan that you'll see a lot of cities going through, concept plans for urban expansion, where a color is put on the
Yeah.
whole piece of land from end to end without really any knowledge about where you can or can't build, and then a kind of average density across the area is placed on. This has been a much more specific, physically conditioned plan. So we think we're closer to having streets laid out where they really will go, block sizes in a size that both complies with Metro's requirements, but also likely to be able to be built, et cetera. So, yeah.
Okay, great.
So for the, like, does not result in a density of 10% below the target, I mean, with developers wanting to, like, you know, maximize how much they're gonna earn, do you guys see that as a problem? Because, I mean, potentially that's a few hundred houses that they could leave out.
We're trying to establish those minimum densities that would be required. This is why I'm saying that, we know the average density, as we talked about, 12 to 15 units per acre. But we don't know precisely what we're going to place upon the neighborhoods yet. That's being developed, but we are trying to make it so that it exceeds the requirements, so that, say, every developer came in and said, I want to vary by 10%. I tend to think developers are going to want to vary it lower, not higher. That's just my kind of like forecast. You know, I may be wrong. And then we might not, if everyone came in, we might not meet the required density to meet the conditions that Metro has placed upon this urban expansion area of 3,300 units. But we're trying to kind of set up the system so that that would, if that happened, if every developer came in and did not, and wanted to reduce by a certain percentage, we would still make it, because they would still have to meet a minimum density.
Problem with that comes in the form of financing, which Todd will cover later. The reduced number of units results in a reduced level of income and funding to provide the same level of infrastructure. So it's important for us to meet those density provisions, because with those density provisions, we're also meeting our financial targets to be able to actually develop and provide the infrastructure required.
Yeah. Of course, you know, then you've got home builders yelling at you, people want bigger houses.
Yeah, they do. They just, you know, if they're willing to pay more for them, I guess,
Yeah.
but.
And that makes it even
Yeah.
more unaffordable.
It does, it has that effect.
More of the street, more of the.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's very true. So I think in our provisions, and Todd's working on them, but, you know, I think we were looking at floor area assessments for those SDCs. So then you would have that assessment based on floor area. So if somebody comes in with a large house that's taking the space of two houses, then it basically gets assessed as a two. You know,
Like cottage in
or,
the city.
right? Or if somebody comes in with a small cottage, you know, it's probably more beneficial for them because they're taking up that space. So.
I've been having a hard time with affordability, and that finally says it right there.
Yeah.
You live in a small house, you have less money to pay for the SDC.
Yeah, so we're trying to get creative. I think Todd's worked up some really good stuff, and it's still in development, but, you know, that's one of the things that we are considering is how we float that and still meet our financial needs.
Okay.
So for like, you know, apartments, there's a limit of like 4 stories, what if you did 10?
Well, there's really no limit in the town center, I don't believe, right?
Really?
Yeah, I think
Pack them in there?
you could. The problem is once you go over a certain height, you can no longer use wood frame. So then you go into a metal frame, and then there's also other provisions, I think, that get kicked into the building code that cost a little bit more. So typically, when you get to that point, it's, from the developer's perspective, less desirable to pay those extra, pay for those extra steps sometimes. But I think we took out the height limit in the town center area, if I remember correctly.
I can't remember where we landed on that yet, so, and I think it's still under discussion, but I actually think that it's going to be one of the first areas to develop.
Yeah.
So you're right. I would say unlimited height might be something that a developer would take advantage of 15 years from now, when there's a proven record of development and there's actually a town center there, and Tigard has also started to build. Someone might build a taller apartment building. That might actually happen on Beef Bend, but I think town center areas kind of, you're gonna probably see that area develop first, and it's gonna, development pattern there will respond to the market as it exists today, which is really not gonna economically support an elevator-served, tall, non-frame building.
So you're saying for that, there's just not the people here that are gonna live in a tall building?
Not yet. I mean, the way that it's probably gonna develop out is the town center will develop first, and it'll be the most urban development for a while. But then as the rest of the area develops out, more urban, say, taller buildings might actually be, more economically feasible at a future point. And that's a reason, I guess, maybe to think about not having a height limit for some types of development in the Beef Bend area.
Yeah. Yeah, don't we have a mixed-use area in the Beef Bend along near 150th or something?
We do allow small, neighborhood serving retail, so it's limited by the size and has to be accessory to a, residential use. It can't be a standalone.
Oh. I was thinking if we had that mixed use in that general area, you could probably change some of the code dynamic or the zone for that particular one to relax some of those height limits that I think we had in that zone. But you have to but that's something to definitely consider. If the Beef Bend zone currently has a 45-foot height limit, only 3, maybe 4 stories.
Comfortable stories.
Yeah, it's 3 comfortable stories. You really need 55 to do 4. I can't remember what we had in the original. Do you recall? I thought we had something in the master plan that talked about height limits and.
I think we mostly just talked about types of buildings. We talked about, and we showed buildings that you tend to see in suburban town center areas that are about 4 stories tall.
Yeah, in the last master plan.
Yeah, I remember seeing a chart or something.
I thought I saw a chart too that
And
had,
it said like the max your apartments could be was, but I don't remember what it could be with the shopping centers on the bottom.
yeah, I thought the shopping centers there was no depicted height limit in the master plan. But outside the town center, I thought that there was some height limit. Going off memory here, anyways, we're going off topic.
Yeah, let me go through again, like, we're at a discussion draft for this document, and I wanted to cover in this presentation all of the various things that the code is responsible for. And there's a lot to talk about regarding the design of buildings, the heights, the minimum densities. Those are still being fine-tuned, but I want to touch on, like, the whole family of provisions that is part of this code. So you're, I guess, reassured that we're going to set up a procedure for, or processes for dealing with all these things. That's also right-sized to the administrative capabilities of a small city.
City, you can hire more people.
So who's going to press the button for the next slide?
I can do that, yeah.
So this next slide, I mean, it's something that we've been talking about, and it's just that the Kingston Terrace chapter will use a form-based code approach to establish design and development standards. A lot of that form-based code approach is demonstrated in this document. It's intended to be clear and objective, like a numerical standard that you can say yes or no to, and but also very mindful of the type of space that we're trying to create with the development and streets combined, or development surrounding parks, so that there's a real intentionality about the shape of the public realm and the way that development is oriented. As you know, all neighborhoods support a variety of housing types. That's very consistent with the whole philosophy of the plan, but also it complies with the middle housing rules. And we keep saying that the eastern neighborhoods especially the rural character neighborhood, is it's hard to talk about because it's not less dense. It's actually going to have the same density on parcels, but there may be more open space in between clusters of housing. So there may be that there's a greater, a smaller ratio of building to open space within the rural character neighborhood. But the density and the size of units is intended to be still dense and small, dense and compact to the extent that we can achieve that.
So will the open space in the rural area be owned by people or by?
It probably will be a combination of dedicated for shared open space and dedicated for park use. So that's
Okay.
it's part of the parks plan to help implement. It's probably a combination of, say, common spaces, common open space that's required as part of a cottage cluster,
Okay,
combined with a park next to a natural resource area.
okay, all right, 'cause, yeah, I'll make sure that the people of King City can take advantage of this rural character.
Yes, exactly. It's not intended to be privatized open space.
Okay.
Some commonalities, if you could go to the next slide. So I know these are things you're probably quite familiar with at this point, and I'll just review them. There are a lot of commonalities amongst the neighborhoods. They all, again, as I keep stressing, will require a mix of housing. They will be required to meet a minimum density, but the town center will have the mixed-use development, like literally vertically mixed-use, commercial, residential. That may be the only instance where we see that in the entire Kingston Terrace area, combined with public green space, linear park space, and a lot of different kinds of public open space that are more plaza-like or more urban in character. We do anticipate denser development near Beef Bend, and then in the central neighborhood and rural character neighborhoods, a lot of the development there is going to be the same, but less open space mixed in to the central neighborhood, like we just talked about. Also, the central neighborhood allows neighborhood serving retail to coexist with residential, only in that area. And we haven't specifically located, we've said that it will be allowed to be built into a development as the developer might see fit. So instead of like saying it must be here in this location, we're saying it could be anywhere within the central neighborhood, within the Beef Bend neighborhood. Sorry. So if we could go to the next slide. We do have a land use table like all zoning codes do, but it's not the main emphasis of this form approach. And it's also somewhat liberal in permitted and conditional uses. The regulating plan, which you have a sample of here in the document, an example of the town center regulating plan is found on page 36. It looks like this. And the regulating plan that applies to the rest of the area is on page 41. You'll see these backbone streets are laid out. Those are required to be located in that location, but allowed to vary by a certain specific numerical margin. That's how a regulating plan tends to work. And also, if you're facing one of these streets, you'll have to meet certain design requirements for the building articulation, and those design requirements are spelled out starting on page 19. They include things like articulation, eyes on the street, main entrance, detailed design, and characteristics like that. So buildings that face certain streets will be required to more or less apply those design standards within. They're intended to be numerically meetable, yes or no. You meet this percentage, or you meet of transparency, say, or you meet this number of indentations for a facade articulation, yes, no. This kind of system allows a small city to be able to administer. It doesn't produce beautiful design, but it kind of prevents the worst design from happening. If a developer, you know, a very skillful developer wants to go beyond, there's nothing to prevent them from doing that. But it's intended to make sure that we don't have blank facades or buildings that have their entries facing parking and not the street, et cetera. So I encourage you to read through that section too, because these are the basic set of standards, things that we think are, you know, over time have been proven to be fundamentally important for the way that buildings are oriented to public areas. Next slide, please. We have these metro conditions to comply with that you're aware of. These are placed on the concept plan, approval. They have to do with the number of units total, 3,300 we're required to provide. So we're setting up the system to ensure that that occurs, as well as for a number of other reasons to ensure that that occurs to support the system's development charges that pay for build out. But we also have a manufactured housing. We were supposed to address manufactured housing. It was a little bit vague how we were supposed to do that. So the approach that we have taken is that we are permitting manufactured housing anywhere where any other type of house would be permitted. So there's no special, it's not a conditional use or anything. It's permitted by right. But it would be subject to those same design and development standards. For example, the same facade, transparency, primary entrance facing the streets, those same design regulations would apply to manufactured housing. Next slide, please. And I'm getting close to the end. So the zoning complies with these new state rules. You'll see in here that we refer to the middle housing, and you're familiar with that by now because you were part of the King City adoption of the middle housing, or Carol, you were. And then in addition, like third bullet down, we have the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules that we need to comply with. This has more to do with parking. So one of the ways that we're complying with that rule is by repealing the parking requirements that we have, where no parking will be required for development here. In fact, we'll have a maximum parking that's permitted. But this is consistent with kind of best practice, is letting the developer decide how much parking they want to provide instead of telling them how much they should provide. This is, all cities are beginning to do this now, and it's pretty common, and the results are not as bad as you might intuitively think. Most developers, when you talk to them, they'll say, I'm not going to build housing without parking. I can't sell it or I can't rent it. So, but you let them decide, also let them decide how they want to manage it, or if they want to have shared parking, you know, on a single block shared by two different developments. So it's much, it's a different approach, but we're complying with the state rule, but we also think it's the best practice. And then last slide is the parks. Mike, next and last. So the parks section, I would encourage you to read it. We have this master plan parks goal to meet, and how we meet it is going to be done through the development agreement, through the location of the parks in the plan, et cetera. And then lastly, we're continuing to coordinate with Tigard and Washington County, but particularly Tigard, and this bottom image includes their early plan for their kind of complementary neighborhood serving Main Street on the north side. That's all my presentation to give you a kind of big picture of all the sections of the code and all the things that it's going to address. If we could, so this is the schedule for code development and adoption. From here to 6/27, we'll be preparing the final code and working out all of these. Many of these things that I've said are in progress. On that will be the hearing. You'll be receiving your packet before that. And,
Did you, before I got here, did you go through, I don't know if this was the meeting for it, anything about cultural resources? Because, you know, the state law says that there has to be an inventory of cultural resources on the property before it's developed. That,
There's some cultural resources identified through the master planning process.
right.
There's detailed findings in the master plan and the transportation system plan
Okay,
on where the cultural resources are throughout the Kingston Terrace master planning area.
okay,
We also talked, very early in the process about rolling in some arts and culture improvements in our parks system development.
mhm,
We had talked about potentially making that a separate SCC, but in the end, that we just decided that it needed to be combined with the parks. And so through the adoption of the parks SCC, we'll also have some implementation of arts and culture, throughout those parks.
okay, all right.
Sure. Sure, there should be some water right over there in the cupboard, either below the sink or up above.
Okay.
Flask.
Parking, when you guys mean best practice, is it like that best practice between the city and the developer, or between like the city and the people who need to park?
it's a best practice for city development. And I don't know if you're like reading things, it's becoming a much more mainstream discussed issue. Like I was listening to a Fresh Air yesterday on NPR, and they were talking to Henry Brevard, who's written a book about parking, how we tended to kind of destroy our cities through parking mandates. And so the trend to remove parking mandates is part of this reform. It's, and it's been about 25 years in the making. A lot of cities are finally catching on to the fact that if they require, say, 2 parking units for every dwelling unit, which is a very typical suburban standard, they can't get affordable housing because that's a lot of parking that's being required, that's built into, it's tens of thousands of dollars go into the cost of a dwelling unit by parking. And if a developer can manage parking, or if a city main street area can manage their parking, they could have less of it, less prominent, and more kind of urbanness, more people spaces, and it tends to create this cycle of more activity, more high value, and if you're carefully managing parking, you still are able to provide parking for all the employees and all the customers, but you don't have to make it the first thing that you see within a development.
So this is for all common spaces and like residential
It's
spaces?
going to apply to all commercial spaces and all residential uses.
So, okay, open shop in the city. Generally, when you don't have a garage on the street, you have either a garage on an alley or you have an alley access. And then you have, that's here in King City, and then you have people parking on the street. Because when you have driveways going up every, just, it's a single parking space, you're gonna have it on their property. So whether it's, if it's accessed from the front, there will be very little space before the next driveway. And so, that Hattie who comes to visit will like bitch and moan when she walks in the door and says, I couldn't find parking anywhere. So how will it all tether together?
We talked about this a lot in the concept plan. This has
Yeah.
been an ethic from the beginning, where in the concept plan, we had pictures showing how alley-loaded blocks tend to work for rental housing. And if you can't, so if you have a well-designed alley,
Uh-huh.
has enough space in front of the garage to park, so on the alley, people are parking they're parking in front of their garage, but it's not
Okay.
the rear.
Uh-huh.
And then you're able to preserve all of that street space for on-street parking,
Mhm.
for visitors or for residents, so
Mhm.
you still get your parking spaces, but they're not, you have closely spaced houses, and each of them has driveways, just like you're saying, you're not gonna have enough room for the parked cars in front. Nor are you gonna have room for all the things that you want, like street trees and a park strip and
Mhm.
that green,
And you're learning to ride a bike, and you're going,
right. Exactly.
Mhm. So, okay, so is there anything in our code that encourages alley?
Yes,
Okay, all right.
and in fact, I mean, we're seeing development interest, and most of that is, expressing the interest in building alley loaded
Great,
blocks, yeah.
great.
One of the only ways we're gonna get that wide variety of housing types too, is
Yeah.
because those are slightly narrower lots. And if you were to front load all of them, the driveways would be too close together.
Mhm.
So developers kind of know this, the ones that I think you're gonna see coming in and developing in the city.
All right,
Okay, yeah.
ready
I
to
could
talk
about
park
parking
funding,
for a long time.
not parking, but parks. My name's Todd Chase. I am a planner economist with FCS Group, and I'm going to talk about how you're going to pay for the backbone streets and the major major parks. First slide. We'll give you an overview. A lot of our focus is on this system development charge, which are impact fees in Oregon. And impact fees are how a lot of urbanizing areas pay for growth, so that new growth essentially pays for itself, more or less. We're going to focus on parks and transportation. The key components of a system development charge include the growth assumptions in the area that we're evaluating and the cost of the facilities to accommodate the growth. We have preliminary calculations to share with you and discuss potential policy considerations to bring forward when we get to council. Next slide, please. So I don't know how familiar you are with system development charges in Oregon. They're a one-time charge on new development, typically at the issuance of a building permit for a change in use. They do not impact existing residents that are already there, that already have a house. They're not paying anything, in terms of taxes or monthly fees. It's literally on property owners or developers that wish to develop. You can charge them based on water, wastewater, storm, transportation, and parks. Today we're just focused on transportation and parks. Those are the two facilities that the city of King City will be kind of responsible for primarily. The other facilities are controlled by either City of Tigard with water or Clean Water Services with wastewater and storm. SDCs are for capital only, not operating, and they can include an existing and a future component in the cost analysis. Typically, you only include an existing component or a reimbursement fee if the city has already made major improvements that have a lot of extra capacity remaining on them to handle future growth, and we don't really have that case here. And therefore, system-wide facilities, which basically mean, if we're talking streets, collectors and above, not the neighborhood local streets that you see in a typical neighborhood subdivision. And the major trunk lines or lift stations with water and the major public parks. Next slide, please. We have really good guidelines on system development charges in Oregon, if you want to look it up. ORS 223.297-314 describes exactly what we can, how we can assess, what we can charge for, how we can change the fees over time, how we can update the project list over time. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there's two components of the fee. There's the reimbursement fee, which we're not going to really be talking about in this version of the methodology report. And there's the improvement fee, which is based on planned improvements. And the improvement fee is a calculation that is essentially can be pretty simple. It's the cost of the capacity increasing facilities that are adopted as part of the capital facilities plan divided by the growth in the system in terms of a measure of demand, which could be housing units, could be population, could be trips. And we usually tack on an admin fee to get the total charge. Next slide. So to understand the methodology, we first have to understand the growth components. And as I mentioned, they can be in terms of dwelling units or population. We have to define kind of a impact area. And in this case, we've defined the area of benefit to be the entire city of King City, because a lot of these facilities will be utilized by, residents no matter where they live in King City. We're also talking about trips. In this case, we're talking about PM peak hour vehicle trips, which is typically how you size a facility. You don't size it for average trips, you size it for that peak PM, usually 2-hour peak. And then we forecast the demand based on current conditions and then future conditions. And then we look at the transportation system plan, the Kingston Terrace master plan, any other public facility plans the city has on hand, CIPs, to come up with the project costs. And that's basically how we come up with the whole equation. So we have kind of the eligible cost of planned facilities divided by the growth over the next 20 years. Now, some cities go out 25 years, Wilsonville goes out 25, some go out only 10, but in this case we're looking at 20 as a planning level. The world changes in 20 years, so we'll have to retool this about every 5 to 10. Next slide, please. We have, from the transportation system plan, we've carried forward 28 projects into the 20-year list. Table's kind of small, but you'll see it when you get the report. They add up to a total of $154 million. That's a lot for a city of 500 people or so. But when we pulled out the Washington County share of the costs, we get down to about a $65 million figure for the facilities that have been identified and costed. And these include a lot of roads, intersections, roundabouts, a lot of bicycle and pedestrian facilities and trails. So a lot of multimodal improvements.
Presentation was updated. This part has different numbers.
Ooh, you got the early one. Yeah.
Oh, you got the one that I sent out initially?
Yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah,
okay.
so I think you sent me a draft and then.
We had to update it for the March 2023 TSP project cost assumptions in there. So the cost did go up.
Okay,
So those were off of the previous.
Mhm.
gotcha, okay.
Yeah. And so, as we go into the project list, and, if the city adopts something, you can change this project list at any time. Doesn't require a big public meeting or anything like that to do that. Cities can do that. And as long as you don't increase the fee per unit, you don't need to go through the 90-day notice and the 60-day review and all that. You just, once we establish a maximum defensible fee, this list, you can add and subtract projects all day long. Next slide, please. The growth component for transportation is estimated in PM peak hour vehicle trips. We've used the Institute of Traffic Engineers Trip Generation Manual, 10th edition, trip generation assumptions for general land use types in the city of King City. So, sorted by industrial, retail, office, for non-residential, and then single family and multifamily for residential types of development. We've looked at current conditions and future conditions, and we've calculated the change in trips. And that's 2,630, is that the number? Net new trips over 20 years. And it's probably a pretty conservatively low number, because it only assumes 50% of Kingston Terrace builds out in 20 years. But that's a number that we feel pretty confident in, that it's likely to happen. Next slide, please. The preliminary system development charge calculation for transportation takes the total city cost share, city/developer cost share, for those collectors and arterial-related improvements that are not funded by Washington County, likely. And then we pulled out what we're likely to collect in terms of transportation development tax revenues based on the growth in the city. And we come up with a adjusted cost basis of $44.44 million, which would be the basis for the system development charge. Divide that by the change in trips, 2630, to come up with an average cost per peak hour trip of $16,900 roughly. Added the admin cost, and that comes to about $17,740 per PM peak hour trip. A single family home typically generates 1 PM peak hour trip. The multifamily homes typically generates about 0.65 of that. So the fee per multifamily home would be about $12,000. And a single family home would be $17,740 for transportation. So we're going to talk about credits now, because a lot of the times developers build these improvements because the city doesn't have the money in the bank, and typically you don't collect these till the building permit comes in for application, so you don't have the money till after the demand hits the system. So next slide, please. Gets into kind of the credit calculations for system development charges. This is the Washington County Transportation Development Tax example. So it'll give the developers, if you're going to build a project that is kind of through your site, and it's a new road, and it's identified in the backbone streets, and it's going to go right through the middle of your site, and you build it, you get 100% credit for the construction of that improvement against your system development charge calculations. So you may not pay anything in system development charges if you build that street, and you might even have a surplus of credits that you get if the costs exceed what we've estimated. And that surplus of credits can typically be applied to future developments that you might build in King City. And in some cases, with the Washington County TDT, developers are allowed to sell or transfer those credits to other developers. If you build a project that's off-site, you'll typically get between 75% and 100% credit for that as well, if it's on the project list. And so, the cities can use the credit system to basically give developers incentives to build these streets and not pay the impact fees. Or, if you don't want to build a $4 million roundabout, you can just pay your impact fees. Call it a day. Next slide, please. There's a little more detail on the credit calculations. Again, I apologize for the size of fonts and all that, but Yeah, basically, you know, the amount of credit typically ranges from 50 to 100%, depending on what you're building. Cities will calculate what's called the oversized portion of the street versus what's needed to serve the local development of what they're proposing, and that oversized portion is what's credit eligible. Next slide, please. Parks. So the parks impact fee right now has 5 projects on the capital facility plan that we're assuming get built in the first 20 years, and they add up to about $32 million. And there's also this community recreation facility, which is unfunded, and it's a big facility, and that's going to be probably a really nice heart of Kingston Terrace at some point in time. A really nice attraction for those who want to live there and for the whole city as well. And to the degree, you know, the city could ask voters to pay for that through a bond, or you could create an urban renewal district to help pay for that, so the tax increment revenues could be used to fund that. Or we could put a little portion of that into this impact fee cost basis as well. And so there's lots of different ways to pay for that facility, but for now we don't have, we didn't put any of it into the parks impact fee component. Next slide, please. And then the growth component for parks is primarily takes into account dwelling unit growth and population growth. And so we are assuming that about 1,788 dwelling units get built over 20 years in Kingston Terrace, and the rest of the city adds about 851 units over the next 20 years, which, you know, I was kind of surprised. The city has added about 270 people per year over the last 12 years. So the city, definitely the rest of the city is growing faster than that calculation indicates. So I think we're being pretty conservative in terms of, you know, the bottom line of growth of 2,639 dwelling units over 20 years. And then if we use census averages of people per dwelling unit based on these types of housing units in King City today, we'd come up with about 4,578 new residents, almost doubling the size of your current population. Next slide, please. So the basis basically assumes that we take the total cost of those parks in the 20-year plan. We've assumed 10% of those costs could potentially be funded by grants, maybe state grants, maybe some metro grants. They're hard to come by these days for parks, but there could be some other funding that comes forward, maybe through an urban renewal plan or something else. That brings the basis down to about $29 million. And then we divide that by changes in dwelling units and understand the cost per dwelling unit on average. And then we vary it based on the number of people per dwelling unit on average, and we come up with a cost per person about $7,300 for the parks. And if we apply that to the type of housing unit, it would be about $11,247 for multifamily dwellings and about $13,800 for detached single-family dwellings. So not out of sync with what we're seeing in a lot of other areas. Next slide, please. So, yeah, how do we compare to other areas? Well, you know, right now we're stacking up to somewhere in between Wilsonville and Tiger River Terrace. South Hillsborough is in there. You know, they're all in the 55 to 63 range right now per dwelling unit, detached home. Of course, the attached and multifamily are a lot less. But, yeah, this would definitely bring us, you know, more in line with what we're seeing in some of the other urban areas. This slide hasn't been updated. Hillsborough is about to update their local transportation SDC, probably by about 10% increase year over year. So that'll bump theirs up closer to what we're proposing at 62,000.
Can I just interject something, Todd? What we saw in the 2023 numbers was a huge increase in inflation, like almost 20%. And that jumped all of our numbers substantially. So where we were at was reasonable. We were right below a lot of these folks, and we were right in the midst of, we were actually lower than a number of them. And then due to the inflated costs that got rolled into our estimates of the transportation system plan, that jumped us in a major way. And we are anticipating that the other cities will also see substantial increases in their system development charges based on the inflation of just the last 2 years.
Yeah, and this is in FY 2023, 2024 dollars. So we're assuming you don't need to bump it up again until like July of 2024 by some index. So we've jumped ahead of the class to the degree we can.
And we also talked with the folks at DCS, and they admittedly are overestimating some of the costs for like the roundabouts and those sort of things, but they're saying the per unit cost and the admin costs and all that stuff is pretty on par with the industry standards coming out now. But like I was talking with one of the representatives from DKS just yesterday, asking how do we have $5 million programmed for a roundabout? Like, it seems like you do a roundabout for a lot less than $5 million. But then they had other roads that were programmed for a lot less than what I was anticipating. And they explained it, well, we have some buffers built in there, but you can also take those buffers from the roundabouts and move them over to the road network to improve other sections of the road. So there's portions of the road that are included with the roundabouts, and they're just estimating that the overall transportation network is in this realm and per unit cost, and it is kind of like the 10,000 foot elevation that we talked about and looking down. And through this SCC methodology, we at least have a solid number to base ourselves off of. And now, as what Todd was just mentioning, the city can choose to take percentage lower or percentage higher, or work it out. But knowing that this will probably be the going rate of the cost that the city has to pay. Now, there's other means that we can employ, through like a gas tax or vehicle registration fees or urban renewal, or those sort of things that maybe augment the SCC, but we don't have those currently.
Yeah, one more slide. Because this one's kind of important. So a lot of cities are having to scale the impact fees by home size. So that and we have data to support that, you don't have typically, 3 people living in a 700 square foot accessory dwelling. It's more like 1. And, it kind of peaks out at about around 3,300 square feet per dwelling, then it starts going down. But, there is a relationship between home size and population, and home size and trip generation. And so what we've been doing in a lot of communities now, they've already kind of moved to this format, and a lot are considering it. Silverton just adopted a similar type of approach. Albany did, Newport did, Portland has it for parks. So we're definitely seeing a movement towards this, and we've been doing it in other states for a long time. But, basically, what we could do for a detached home, and you could even apply to attached homes, and even, in this case, mobile homes that are smaller than a standard size home, which tends to be about 2,700, 2,500 square feet. They pay less because their impacts on the systems are less. And the larger homes, typically, when it gets above 3,000 feet, pay a little more than the average home. And so, but on average, it's revenue neutral. The city collects the same amount of revenue. So one thing we could consider in our methodology is to scale the fees by home size for both parks and transportation.
So this means that, if I'm building a smaller home, okay, so there's 100% of the fee. If I'm building a smaller home, I might spend 70% of the fee, and the larger homes be 130% of the fee?
It just, there's one fee for a smaller home, and then one fee for a standard size home, and then a separate fee for the larger home. And they typically, you know, so you just, when you walk in the counter, you know what your fee will be based on your square feet of heated floor area.
Okay, that's what,
So it's flat rate versus percentage?
Yep, it's a flat number.
I think we should also consider what lot size impacts are too.
It's tough to do that.
Yeah.
It's tougher on lot size. And the communities that do it based on lot size typically are using recycled water for irrigation purposes, and that's why they're doing it. Which I don't think.
Use plumbing fixtures?
Yep, for water and sewer, you can. And, you know, but we're talking transportation and parks.
So is there a way to, because, you know, I can see someone coming in with a 1 acre or 3 or 4 acre lot with a small 700 square foot house, and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, granted, they're not putting the same demand on the system, but they're not really maximizing the density that we need for that.
Don't they have a minimum density requirement?
Yeah, there would be that if they were to divide it, or, yeah.
You probably wouldn't approve it unless they did shadow plots of all the future units, you know,
Right,
right?
yeah.
but if they don't build a house, we wouldn't get the.
Right. You typically don't get it until they come in for the building permit.
Right.
So I'm really interested in affordability because I've got 2 daughters who can't afford anything, rental even, and I went through the whole process of what if I bought a duplex, you know, and it still doesn't pencil out for somebody making both of them are minimum wage right now.
Yeah.
Has anybody ever done the, what I would kind of just described, saying, okay, these people who are living in smaller homes, probably are living in a smaller home because they don't have as much money extra to spend. Has anyone ever actually scaled the fee for a smaller home, like a 70 and 130 for a big rich guy who puts in marble columns?
Yeah, well, we scale it, we take that, it certainly, it's more equitable to scale the fee based on, you know, based on home size because it reflects income of the household typically, but it can. Typically with more wage owners, there's more income, you know, and so, but we don't use that as the basis. We use the basis of system impacts based on people or trips. And so now, because system development charges typically only account for about maybe 10% of the cost of building a home, if you reduce the impact fees by 50% for a small home, you're really only saving 5% on the total cost of construction.
Okay.
And the developers we've interviewed have candidly indicated that not all that is passed on to the homeowner or renter. Some of it goes in profit, you know, for the developer. So it's kind of split. So really the cost savings for the homeowner might only be nominal, 2-3%. So impact fees, system development charges are just one tool to create housing affordability.
What's the position on accessory dwelling units?
Good question. Wilsonville waives SDCs on dwelling units currently. Yeah.
We will not do that. We'll go more up to the floor area. So my suggestion at this point in time is to, at assess them equally, but off of a floor area piece. So someone builds a 3,000 square foot, dwelling unit, well, that 3,000 square foot dwelling unit is going to be based off the floor area of that 3,000 square. And then somebody builds a 800 square foot ADU, that 800 square foot ADU is assessed off that square.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be a relatively low fee compared to the other one. Probably be, maybe it'll be 10,000, for the ADU. I don't know. We'll have to do the math. But I think that's kind of how it works out, because they will have a system impact. Now, if they have the house there currently and they add the ADU, and there may not be, they're going to hook in the same water and sewer line, for example, they may not get those impact fees at all, right?
We don't regulate those.
Right.
And I'm pretty sure they would get an impact fee. Depends on their meter.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
if they upgrade their meter, they have to.
So then the last slide is kind of all the questions for today. That's schedule. So the schedule's similar to what Marcy indicated earlier. August 2nd is kind of the first big hearing date we're working towards. In the meantime, we want to put a methodology report together and out on the street for a 60-day review process at the end of May.
These two items will be kind of paralleling each other through all the different steps, plan commission and final adoption.
And then the real last slide is all the questions. So the questions are, should other projects be added to the project list before we, really kind of draft this? Should we include a piece of for example, the community recreation facility in the parks? Impact fees just to have a placeholder there to keep it on the list, even with the 10% number. Should the city phase in the fees over time? May not matter much, but if you adopt something between now and say the fall, these new fees would be in effect early, January. And development could come in with an annexation request, and there you go, you got the fees all ready to go. Or cities say, well, these are big fees. We're going to let the development community kind of digest them over 2-3 years, and we'll just implement them over 3 years, index them with inflation, but just, so we just kind of roll them out more slowly. There's other policies, that Tigard River Terrace has, the city of Tigard did for River Terrace, where they have a policy that's at least 75% of the fees collected, the TVTs collected in River Terrace, are spent on projects in River Terrace, not used on projects elsewhere in the city. And that made that placated the developers a bit more. Should the city consider scaling the SDCs? It sounds like Mike would recommend that, we do, and I think you might agree. And then should there be exemptions for affordable housing, deed restricted, or ADUs? So any input on those would be real nice.
Well, the other thing that we talked about, Todd, over the phone, and you mentioned it earlier in your presentation, was the potential for some of these SDCs to be reimbursable, right? So a certain amount of them are developer reimbursable should the developer go and do the improvements that are on the list.
Yeah. Well, that's a requirement by law. The credits last 10 years by law. They may not go beyond 10 years. So if the developer builds something and gets more credits than what his fees would have been, if he doesn't do more development or transfer it, he could lose those credits. So that is a question, though, to make it more developer inducive, you let the credits be transferable. So, that's a policy decision, regarding credits.
How would that work for us? Would it just be transferable within King City, though, right?
Yes. Yep. And the TDT too, you could, you know, you have to work with Washington County, but somebody gets TDT credits, you know, you would hope that it's also locked into King City.
And I trust that when we finally get through the methodology and everything else, there will be like an equation that can be pulled out so the staff can easily assess what those SPC credits might be functionally, or is that something that's going to have to be an equation that's applied?
So you'll probably need to hire, as part of your admin fee, you know, a traffic engineer on call to basically do quick math on, you know, to review the developer's proposal, where the developer says, this is the cost of a local street, this is what you're asking me to pay for this section to my project, and here's the difference, and then that engineer would review it. Not you.
So I'm looking at that affordable housing, my chart. And 'cause back in school, I studied affordable housing, and when it was first, thought of, it was for young men who just were starting their first jobs, and then it was for young families so that they could save for a home in the future. And then it became in the park, that we all know of. But it occurred to me that, in all of those cases, the government entity, the jurisdictions really, affirmatively went in and put a lot of money into them, built them. And I grew up in Chicago, and, affordable housing always seemed to come from the government.
Mm-hmm.
So as close as we can get without, you know, going out and being developers, is that FDC exemption for a deed, what's it called?
Deed restricted.
Deed restricted
Yeah,
home.
at a certain income level.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that might be
Mm-hmm.
our contribution to
Yeah.
public housing,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, and some cities will do that, you know, you'd have to set it 30% or 50%, you know, that's a good incentive. There are other tools. Newport has a construction excise tax for affordable housing, 1%, I believe, and they use that to, you know, basically pay for the SDCs for, in this case, I think it's 120% or below deed restricted housing. So that's one tool. Hood River has a similar tool, and they've used that money to buy land and then do a development agreement to build housing on that land. So the construction excise tax pathway is a good one in Oregon for some cities. Would need to be, doesn't need to be voter approved either, but you might require it in King City to be voter approved.
Aren't some developers just required to designate this house is going to be deed restricted? And I think in my development, actually, there is.
Inclusionary zoning,
I think that's more of a big urban concept that we see in like New York and other things like that, where they put the rent caps or rent limits, and then there's a certain number of units per complex have those rent caps or rent limits to keep it a certain level of affordable or attainable.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, there was a development in Chicago when they replaced, I want to say Serena Green, but I don't know. But they went to a presentation in 2006, and he was just very proud that he had built, every house is the same, and so you really didn't know what the deed restricted houses were. But there were just deed restricted houses peppered in.
Mm-hmm.
And it allowed people to, I mean, some dignity. I don't live in that area, I live with everyone else, but I'm still,
I mean,
support it.
urban renewal is another pathway. Hermiston adopted urban renewal district recently last year, where with a $1 million affordable housing fund in it, plus the infrastructure, you know, and that's in an area smaller than this in terms of land area and development potential. So, you know, that's another way to get there. So, you know, all these in combination help move the needle a little bit, you know, but,
One of the things that Todd mentioned and that we've talked about throughout this process is the development of the City Hall Rec Center down at that end. And so using some of the urban renewal funds that we're talking about, or getting some bonds through urban renewal, would allow us to build that structure. And part of that concept is to also add potential for housing up above. So what we've looked at is kind of implementing something similar to the Cornelius model, where it has their city hall and library, and I think they have a small, like, daycare or rec center thing in there as well, but then they had senior housing up above, but they did a public-private partnership to make that happen. And so we would probably need to do something similar to that in order to try to do the housing up above, because obviously we're not field, but we do have an interest in provide some attainable or affordable housing to a certain level, right? So there might be options there where there are resources through Washington County, through REACH, through there's a hundred different nonprofits out there that focus on housing.
Yeah.
So bringing them in as a potential public partner or a private partner into getting some of these housings combined and get some of that funding going, to combine funding to get this nice structure built up to.
Yeah.
It is considered. I don't know, there is a lot of coordination that needs to happen to make it, that vision come to a reality. And we're just kind of, right now, just starting to formulate what that vision might look like. And we're trying to get an RFP out right now for, like, design. But it's a long haul till we get there. 2 years at least.
In Portland, there's down in, I'm in Chicago, on the Gold Coast, Pearl District. There was an affordable housing, the whole thing was built right there specifically by a private developer, and he's got on the floor, he said, an age nursery school, preschool, and a kindergarten. He got actually, Portland Public to sponsor that part of the building. So that might be way too.
that's using urban renewal.
Is that
Yeah.
renewal? Okay.
So there's the Metro bond that just went through, and I know not a lot of those figures are getting gobbled up right now, but, you know, by the time we get around to potentially developing this, it might go faster than we think. We might be able to move faster on acquisition and development of a city parcel in that area. And, you know, not only would it benefit the city, but it might actually develop and help that downtown core really get established and take off. So there's, I think there's potential to move rather quickly, but we've really got to get our ducks in a row, if you will, and start the process. In my opinion, we're kind of behind the 8 ball on being ready to break ground with the group that's already out there and sharing it.
Yeah.
So I think we as a city are behind the 8 ball way behind from where they're already.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking, Oregon's doing a free childcare experiment, and there ends up to be childcare funds available. That would be a good first floor. I was actually, here's a Mixed Generations is a really good model of that.
Want to move on to the last
That's it
slide?
for-
I think you've only got one more slide.
That was it.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, appreciate your input and direction. You know, if you think of ideas, you know, email them over and we'll carry them into council.
Figure out Ronnie's computer here, so bear with.
I don't
I
know.
got the presentation in an email, but it's an older copy.
Mm.
Because, yeah, Mike just had to, email the presentation to me. I can forward it to you.
Apologize. Well, thank you all for your presentations today.
Sure.
Sorry, I missed this, I have to.
Glad to be here. Are we all good to go?
I think so, yes. Thank you very much, and we'll continue on, and we'll see you guys in another month or two, right? Some fast, some earlier than one.
See me tomorrow.
Yeah.
I have questions for you.
All right, fair enough, yeah. We'll chat and get it knocked down. So we have a meeting tomorrow, right, at, I saw the invite, so I'll be there. All right, so thank you very much. Marcy, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Are we done?
We're all good. We're done. I'm gonna shut it off. Thanks for everyone attending.
Just the people on there was, that's all that was attending?
No, there was, some people that were attending.
Yeah, I apologize, I'm trying to fit all that cardio rehab into an already this evening.
Yeah.